Welcome back to the Foxhole. I'm your host, James Rosen, coming to you from the Washington Bureau of Fox News. You can follow me on Twitter at James Rosen FNC. One of the defining characteristics of today's best political reporters is that they tend to harbor deep down in their souls, and with such fervor that they seldom speak of it, an intense longing to have practiced their craft at some time other than the present. Among members of the elite Beltway journalism crowd, it is axiomatic that to have been a member of the elite Beltway journalism crowd circa 1950, 1975, or even as late as 1985 was a lot more fun than it is now. Our predecessors contended with fewer news outlets and fewer deadlines, meaning they faced less competition, less need for instant and continuing product or content, and had more time to actually do reporting and pursue leisure activities. Britt Hume, for example, has told me of how, after filing his story for the day, he played tennis with Reagan-era spokesman Larry Speakes. The characters were more colorful, there was greater access to them and to their staffs, more drinks and camaraderie, fatter expense accounts, more book deals and lecture gigs to be had, and so on. To have been at the top of the game in the Mad Men era, goes this line of thought. That's when the game was rich and enriching. Now, as Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone wrote already a decade ago, and I quote, "Every junior staffer learns to keep his head straight after the 15th shot, and every conversation you have with anyone is a DEFCON 5 affair because everyone knows that anything they say could end up on HBO or under a Philip Gurevich byline within 10 minutes or in Alex Pelosi's documentary 6 months later." When exactly did it get to be this way? Our visitor to the Foxhole today thinks he has identified the precise moment. Matt Bai is the national political columnist for Yahoo News. For a decade, he was a political correspondent for the New York Times Magazine. And he is the author, most recently, of All the Truth Is Out, The Week Politics Went Tabloid, published in September by Knopf. Matt Bai, thanks for visiting the Foxhole today.
James, thanks for having me here.
Okay, so you started work on this book. Before I even do that, was I just projecting onto you, or you feel as I do that it would have been a lot better to be Matt Bai in 1965 or 1975?
It might have been better to be Matt Bai last week, actually. I'm getting so old. Yeah, I say right away, up front in the introduction to the book, when I talk about Richard Kramer and what it takes in 1988, that you grow up, if you're in our generation, right, you grow up reading these books, reading What It Takes, reading Fear and Loathing on the campaign trail, feeling like what you want, if you want to be a journalist, is to be in the front row of history and see it and explain it to people and experience it. And the reality has been, for most of us, very different. And I've actually been more fortunate than most, because working for the New York Times Magazine for a very long time, I was able to do very long, extended profiles and interviews, and a lot of people were pretty gracious with their time. But you do have the sense that some real sense of who people are as human beings and their worldviews and what they believe and where they came to believe it gets lost now,
or
because
hidden,
of the environment,
or
withheld, or purposely obscured. And I don't know that this moment I talk about in the book is a precise moment of change. I think there's a continuum. I think these cultural changes happen gradually. There's not a switch that gets flipped and it's one way one day and one day the next. But I think you can point to this moment where it manifested itself. You can say, in 1987, there's this moment where everybody went, aha, now we're there. This is where we are now. And that was Gary Hart's moment, and I think it had tremendous reverberations.
You started working on this book in 2009, or you decided to write this book in 2009.
That's right, yeah.
Why were you thinking about Gary Hart in 2009? What do you suppose it was that drew you to the subject at that time?
That's what everybody wanted to know in 2009 and thereafter, because it was a weird thing to be thinking about.
My nose for news leads me to it here now.
Right. No, the short answer is, and I go through this, in the book, as you know, the short answer is I did a piece on him way back in 2002, beginning of 2003, when I was pretty new at the New York Times Magazine. He was making noise about running for president again, and I've met him for the first time. And I wrote a piece that he really didn't like. And then over time I didn't like so much, although I certainly think it was better than he thinks it was. But
what was the basic problem with it?
My basic point of the piece was kind of, he wasn't going to be president. That he wasn't even going to run for president. What he really wanted was to be a statesman. And I sort of repeated the idea that he'd kind of self-destructed, found himself in this place where no one would take him seriously. But I came to reevaluate that view over the years and talking to people, and I began to connect it to this experience you and I are talking about watching campaigns but feeling like there's this distance, feeling like people are always afraid of you, feeling like you can't get at the ideas. And I began to think differently about that moment and about him. And then when I began to ask questions and poke around in the history of that scandal, what I found was that it wasn't at all the way we thought we remembered it. There were some really significant differences between what was accepted wisdom about that moment and what actually happened. And I became kind of obsessed with it, as a reporter does. I mean, I only get obsessed at book length with like one thing a decade. You know, I don't have a lot of obsession, but this one I really...
Which is fortunate for your family.
Yeah, my family, my publisher, who knows. But I was really, I was stuck on it and believed in it, and fortunately found editors and you know, others who believed in it and was able to execute. I'm very, very proud of it. I think it's the best thing I've ever done.
Our guest in the Foxhole today is Matt Bai, national political columnist for Yahoo News, a longtime political correspondent for the New York Times Magazine prior thereto, and author most recently of All the Truth Is Out, the week Politics Went Tabloid, published in September by Knopf. And you write in the book, and I quote, "As anyone alive during the 1980s knew, Gary Hart, the first serious presidential contender of the 1960s generation, had been taken down and eternally humiliated by a scandal of his own making, an alleged affair with a beautiful blonde whose name, Donna Rice, had entered the cultural lexicon, along with the boat on which they had been photographed together, Monkey Business. This was Hart's enduring legacy, the inevitable first line in his front-page obituary, no matter what else he did thereafter, even if he cured cancer or found the unified string theory or went completely bonkers and tried to hijack an airplane mid-flight. When they talked about him now in Washington, Hart was invariably described as a brilliant and serious man, perhaps the most visionary political mind of his generation, an old-school statesman of the kind Washington had lost its capacity to produce. A top Democratic strategist in town had once described Hart to me as the most important politician of his generation who didn't become president. But such descriptions were generally punctuated by a smirk or a sad shake of the head. Hardly a modern scandal passed, whether it involved a politician or entertainer, that didn't evoke the inevitable comparisons to Hart among the reflective commentators. In popular culture, Gary Hart would forever be that archetypal anti-hero of presidential politics, the iconic adulterer. That's from the opening passages of All the Truth Is Out. And what struck me about it is, it wasn't just that Gary Hart cheated on his wife. To me, what I always remembered about that whole episode was that he had actually dared reporters prior to being caught at it by saying, in words to the effect of, if you follow me around, you'll see I lead a very boring life. And so reporters did follow him around, correct? Right. First of all, who broke the Gary Hart story?
Well, not correct. And this is one of the fascinating things about this, our memory of this event. Correct in certain aspects, but not in the important ones. He said that, but he did not, you and I may remember it. I don't know for you, but for me, I thought, he must have said that at a big news conference or something. He said it to E.J. Dionne, who was reporting for the New York Times Magazine. He said it in a moment of frustration. E.J. did not see it as a challenge. He thought it meant that Hart had sort of gotten his behavior under control, whatever that meant.
So this had been an issue whispered about.
It had been whispered about, and so it came up in this interview. It was a long magazine interview. Hart says, he gets tired, and he says, look, follow me around. You'd be very bored. The Miami Herald gets a tip from a caller who I unmask in the book, actually, because it's been long enough to do that. They act on that tip. They put him under surveillance. And while they are putting him under surveillance, that story is published, the advance edition of that story is published. They see the quote, which has not yet seen the light of day. And they take the quote and put it in their initial story after they have put him under surveillance and think they've caught him with a woman, So, in effect, they were onto that story, decided to put him under surveillance, and began literally hiding out in his bushes and around his house, a presidential candidate, the presumed nominee of the Democratic Party, before they ever knew he had uttered those words. And what that means, the significance of which, James, is we changed the rules. He didn't change the rules. We think he changed the rules. We as an industry, the Miami Herald, changed those rules, and we need to own up to that.
Also, as a point worth noting, was not then and is not now a tabloid.
No, and that's kind of what's shocking about it, right? I mean, you'd had paparazzi and tabloid journalism, of course, going back in Hollywood for decades. And in fact, there's an interesting element to this where Warren Beatty, who was a good friend of Hart, says to him, there's no more privacy anymore. You need to listen. There's no such thing as privacy. Because
that was before the event.
Yeah, because he's been out in Hollywood and he gets what's going on. But it had not come to politics, and it has certainly not come to what we would consider the respectable media. And it was very controversial at the time. I think what the Herald did would be controversial today, a sort of undercover surveillance of a presidential candidate's home, and based purely on this question of, is he an adulterer, is he not an adulterer? And of course, they connected it to larger issues of morality. Was he the moral public leader he said he would be? character. And character becomes, in that moment, and subsequently, the principal driving force of our campaigns, is that everything becomes fair game under the idea of character. Well, and character becomes more important than any single idea or any issue. And in
policy,
any policy. And in that moment, in 1987, you know, after the surveillance, where you have this amazing moment where these Herald reporters, you know, 4 reporters have him pinned against a brick wall behind his home, the presumed nominee of the Democratic Party, and they're shouting at him, "Who's the woman in your house, and are you having sex with her, and how long have you known her?" Nothing like this has ever happened. And within 4 days, because now you have the birth of satellite technology, which is brand new in that moment, you have Paul Taylor of the Washington Post, who stands up at a national news conference, nothing like this has ever been seen in presidential politics, and says, you know, "Senator, have you ever committed adultery? Not in this circumstance, have you ever cheated on your wife?" And it's a watershed moment. You know, people who were in that room remember it always. They'll tell you, you know, it was a shocking moment. And in a very real sense, I mean, that's where political journalism crosses a Rubicon.
Did Gary Hart cooperate with your research for this book?
He did. It's not a subject he loves to go back through. It took some work. And he's a private man still. You know, for 25 plus years, Gary Hart has refused to discuss the details of this incident. Not, you know, for a bunch of reasons, but I think principally because he thinks now as he thought then, it's really nobody's business what he did in his private life, and he didn't think he was doing anybody else any good by legitimizing it as an area of inquiry, even as the culture sort of passed that question by. So, you know, part of what I deal with in the book very overtly with readers is how much do you need to know about what happened, and how I deal with Hart on that question. And I won't spoil whatever suspense exists.
So
but
he never wrote about this episode himself?
No, I mean he wrote a couple of years ago a memoir about his life called "The Thunder and the Sunshine," and he dispensed with this scandal in about a paragraph. He just said everybody knows about this, and I'm not going into it. Whereas for others, it is a defining part of his life, and so he was very gracious and spent a lot, you know, many hours talking to me and hosting me, which I really appreciated.
Now, just in the paragraph of your main text that I just read, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I spotted another of these things that we all think we remember about this event. You say that Hart and Rice, the boat on which they had been photographed together, monkey business. But I looked at the photograph just before coming out here, and it doesn't seem they're actually on the boat. They're actually on the pier,
That's
correct?
Right. It's more than that, and I talk about this too. It's not, first of all, they're not on the boat. They're on the pier, as you point out very astutely. They're also surrounded by hundreds of tourists milling around. So what the public remembers as this illicit photo of the two of them together on the boat alone with this very mischievous look, they're actually in a public place at the time that photograph was taken. And the photograph, which everyone thinks drove him out of the campaign, didn't even surface until weeks after he had already left that campaign. So the photograph actually had nothing to do with ending his campaign.
One might argue that Gary Hart should have known in the year of our Lord, 1987, that we were no longer in the Kennedy era.
Right.
And that major politicians did not enjoy from the news media the kind of free pass for that kind of behavior that they traditionally had.
But this is part of the story that you asked me what got me obsessed, and this is part of the story that always really fascinated me, because that is what people have always said and always thought, and it's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, which is,
it boils down to, what were you thinking?
Yeah, you knew it was going. Well, how could you be so dumb? As Hart himself will tell you, this is the question he always heard: how could you be so stupid? But in every moment, if you cover politics long enough, and it's not just politics, anywhere in the culture, in any moment, somebody gets caught in between the currents of social change. Somebody ends up with a foot in one place and a foot in the other. There's always somebody. And Hart, comes up in a very different world. He's a Westerner, right? He's born in Kansas, ends up in Colorado, right? He's reticent. You know this from interviewing Vice President Cheney as much as you have. There's a reticence to that generation of men in the West, right? He doesn't speak about his emotions. He doesn't speak about his private life. He's drawn to politics by the example of the Kennedys. He serves on the church committee. He's the youngest member on the church committee, so he knew what the Kennedys were up to, and he understood that none of it became public. At one time, he separates twice from his wife. At one point, he separates from his wife, and he sleeps on Bob Woodward's couch for weeks. Nobody writes about it. Nobody says Hart's off dating women every night. So he has a whole other life experience that he brings to this. And his younger aides say to him, Sender, they're serious now. Like, these people are interested in your personal life. They're interested in your character, what they call your character. And he can be made to believe that somebody might write that story, but he can't for the life of him imagine that someone's going to go searching for the evidence. To him, that's like thinking aliens are going to beam down.
It's just inconceivable in his experience in Ken that this kind of attention would be paid to that kind of matter.
It is, especially since the older guys who he'd known in the press corps for years, close friends who knew all about his extracurricular activities and with whom he'd had dinner and drinks, weekly, they're still there. And they're still on the campaign. So even though you have these younger generation of reporters coming in, you have this, post-Watergate generation that's just arriving on the trail with a very different sensibility. To Hart, it all feels more or less the same as it was. And I think you have to have some sympathy for a person caught in a moment like that.
One of the things I brought with me here to confront you with was evidence that perhaps we might say that politics went tabloid before 1987,
sure.
And the Kennedys figure prominently in this. And so I actually bought this with you in mind, and I hope we can get a good shot of it. Here is the February 4, 1974 edition of Midnight, which is every inch a tabloid, a supermarket tabloid of its era. So I also actually purchased this because it has a Linda McCartney interview. That's how deranged. You were talking about obsession. And